Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma daf Pei Vav. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to start with Rabba's question at the bottom of Pei Hey Amud. Rabba asked, Shevet hapochato b'damim mahu. So Shevet we described in the Mishna as referring to the amount of money that one has to sit in bed and is losing on account of not working. But here Rabba seems to be asking something else. If you have, the other issue of Shevet is really what we call nezek, which is how much does your injury devalue you on the market? So now you can no longer do X jobs, so you can only do certain things because you no longer have a hand, let's say. So what is the damage that was caused to you? That we really call nezek. Now Rebbe wants to know, if it devalues you, then do we have to pay it? Now it's a little bit strange because of course you have to pay. That's what nezek is. To which they ask, Hechidami, what exactly was he asking about? To which they explain, Kigon shikawa yadovitzim ta yado, you got hit on your hand shriveled up, but it's eventually going to go back to what it was before. So you get a hit, your value is less right now. If you got a job right this moment, they would say, oh, we don't want you for this because you can't really do that. But eventually you're going to go back, so it's no long-term damage. So what's the halacha? Do we say, you don't actually get damages, which again, they're calling shevet, but it really is nezek. You're not going to get the damages for this. Odilma hashtamiat afchate. Or do we say, no, right now, you are lower in value at this present moment. So that has value. In other words, again, we're not talking about the days that you're going to sit in bed and do nothing, and we have to pay you for that. That's regular shevet. This is the amount that you're worth on the job market is lower at the present moment, and you're going to get compensated for that. To which they say, let's try to learn it from the following source. Tashma if you hit your mother or father, but don't cause an injury, meaning you don't cause them to bleed, which means that you don't get the death penalty. If you don't get the death penalty, but you did cause them some damage, then either that case or which we already learned, if you damage someone in Yom Kippur, where there is no death penalty, so chayab b'kulan, you're going to have to pay for all 5 things for the damage that you caused. So now they want to know, what exactly is the case that you didn't do a chabura to your parents, you didn't cause blood to come out, and yet you're going to be liable for 5 things. You obviously caused some sort of damage. Lav kigon, we're going to suggest, and then this will answer our question of Raba, Lav kigon shikawa yadov, is it not the case where you caused temporary damage? And that's exactly why you're not going to get the death penalty. There was no blood, but you did cause some injury, which will eventually go back to being normal. And what does it say? Katane chayab b'kulam, which means you are liable for the damages you caused for the value of what your parent will now be worth on the shuk, a lower value temporarily. But the Gemara is going to reject and suggest several other possible explanations. Each time we might have a problem with it, but eventually we'll get to a fourth, which could be a good explanation, in which case this really is not germane to our topic. So option 2 is to say, no, maybe it has nothing to do with our case. It has to do with someone who caused their parents to go deaf. It doesn't have a chabura, there's no blood coming out. But they say that, and then it's permanent. And then if it's permanent, then it has nothing to do with our question, which is temporary damage. But didn't Rabba say, you get killed if you cause your father to go deaf? Why? Father or mother, in this case, it just happens to say father, because there's no way to cause your parent to go deaf without inflicting some sort of wound. There must have been some blood that got dripped in the ear. Maybe they're talking about internal bleeding. Whatever, Rabbi had this approach that there's no way there wasn't any blood. So that means that you'd be liable the death penalty, in which case you wouldn't be liable for the damages because you wouldn't pay for that, because kim leba derive mine, you always pay you get death penalty, you don't have to pay damages, in which case it can't be talking about that in this source. Third option, you shaved off the father or mother's head. To which they say, and that was what we're talking about, you caused them damage by shaving off their head, and that you would pay the 5 things for, and there's no blood. To which they say, well, if that's the case, so it might be rejecting the first explanation of where you hit them on the hand and it's eventually going to come back. It's only temporary, but shaving is also temporary damage. It's going to grow back. So then we would have an answer. Hainu baya means that that's exactly our question. And then you do have an answer. Chayav bekulan. You're liable for the damages. To which the answer, no, you can reject that as well. Amri hacha b'mayaskinan, kigon desachon asha. He put a depilatory cream on the father's head, dilo hadar, or on the mother's head, and it won't come back. It's permanent hair loss. Sa'al, now we're going to go through. What are the 5 things and why are you liable for all those 5 things for causing the hair loss? So Tza'al, what kind of pain was there? Well, de'itle kartufne bereshe. He has now these, but from the cream, it caused an irritation on the head, and savche mehanu kartufne, and he's screaming in pain because of these things that are now on the like bumps on the head from the cream. Ripoi debai isuye. Well, you need to pay the doctor's bills because now you need to cure those things that are on the bumps on the head. Shevet, well, what's the shevet? Okay, you have these bumps on your head and you're now bald. Well, why can't you work now? I mean, most jobs, it really doesn't affect you. To which they answer, well, shevet having mirake bekube, for example, let's assume you were some sort of dancer, and debaya machave gune aresha. So Rashi explains that you would do this thing moving around your head in a particular way to show like the way clowns do funny things, and you would use your head as part of your entertainment act. And now you can't do it because your head looks disgusting with these bumps on it and you can't actually do it. So that would be an example where you would have to pay shevet. So this seems to imply if you did this normally, you wouldn't really have to pay shevet. But if you had this unique job, then that would be the payment for shevet. And right, lo mechave mehanu kartufne, because you have these kartufne on your head, you can't do that show that you normally do. Boshet, here they just say it very blankly, and we're going to see this same statement later in the daf. Boshet en lecha boshet gadol mizeh. There is no such thing that's more humiliating from this. Okay, interesting, right? People are very particular about their hair, right? Either whether, they cause all your hair to fall out and now you're bald, that's a totally humiliating thing. Or it could be they're talking about the baldness with these bumps on your head, like that is quite humiliating to walk around like that. So it's like they don't even need to explain it. It's saying, oh, come on, what's more humiliating than that? Okay, so now in the end, we tried to use this source. In the end, we said the source is not germane to our topic, nothing to do with it. It's talking about permanent damage, and therefore we don't have an answer. But the Gemara tells us the milda debaye leil Raba pshita leil Abaye. But this question that was Raba was struggling to come up with an answer. It was actually obvious to Abaye lahachkisa. It was obvious to Abaye that this was going to be the halacha. We'll see in a minute what that is. Rava lahachkisa, and to Rava it was obvious in a different direction. Meaning Abaye and Rava each had clear-cut answers here, but each one had a different clear-cut answer. De itmar, and here's an introduction to the machloket. We're going to now see 2 machlokot. One is about Rava's question, one is about a similar topic, but a little bit different. Hikal al yadovet samta v'sofa lachzor. This is exactly the topic. You get hit on your hand, and it's eventually going to heal completely. Abaye omer noten lo shevet gdola v'shevet ktana. Okay, what's shevet? Large shevet and small shevet. So large shevet is what we're talking about. The damage, the value that your body is now devalued on the marketplace because your hand is no good. Even though it's only temporary, you're going to have to pay that. And shevet ktana, which is the fact that right now for the next 5 days, you're sitting in bed and you can't go to work. You can't do anything. You can't even, right, as we saw before, you can't even watch cucumbers. But Rava Amal, eno noten lo ela demei shivto shebachol yom v'yom. Right, I'm using the cucumber example because that's what they said. When you get paid shevet, you don't get paid based on what your actual job was, but based on the job of a cucumber watcher. Rava Amal, eno noten lo ela demei shivto shebachol yom v'yom. Rava says you just get the shevet ktana, basically, just the amount that you didn't go to work for those few days, but you don't get the shevet dola here because, again, your hand is going to go back to being fine, and therefore your value in the shuk is only depreciated for the moment, but it won't be for the long term, and therefore the person who did it doesn't have to pay you anything. So they have a machloket. Itmar. There's another machloket they have, which is akoter yad eved hivri shel chavero. Now we're talking about someone cuts off the arm of a Jewish slave who's living under a Jewish master. Now there's damage to the Eved Ivri for the long term, because this is not short-term damage. This is permanent damage. This is temporary. And there's damage to the owner because the owner now has a slave that's worth a lot less because they can't do anything with, they can't do a lot of things because they're missing one arm. So Abaye Amal, noten lo shevet gdola le'eved v'shevet ktana l'rav. The question and the debate between them is going to be, who gets what. So Abaye, they obviously get both the shevet gdola, which is the damages, the amount the person is now worth less on the slave market, and they're also going to get the amount that they can't go to work. The question is who gets what. So since it's permanent damage, and the Eved Ivri will be free at some point, right? They work for 6 years, then they go free. So the value of the damage, the long-term damage, goes to the slave. And the shevet tana, Rav. But the fact that right now they're not working makes sense, goes to the master. Abaye's opinion makes perfect sense. But Rava says, Rava Amaha, kol yinaten la'eved v'yilakach be'em kalka, v'arav ochel pirot. He has a different solution. It says, take the shevet dola, take the shevet tana, give it to the master. The master will buy land with it. Then they'll be left with the principal, which will end up going to the slave when he leaves the house of the master. But the amount that he gets, the produce from that, the whole time that he stays as a slave in the master's house, the proceeds will go to the master. So the master will get compensated by the proceeds, the fact that he now has a worker who works less, and the fact that he didn't work for X number of days at all, doing anything while he was sick. Then he'll get that from the produce that this land will create. And that way they both end up getting something. It's actually a creative solution, because then the Eved, who really is considered his own person, right? He's not owned by the master, as you remember. That's the difference between a Canaanite slave and a Jewish slave. And therefore, he'll get all the damages himself later, but the proceeds in the meantime will go to the slave owner. Now they say, so that's a machlokah between Rav and Shmuel. So now they say the following, Rava and Abaye. Pshita pichet etzel atzmo ve'etzel rabo lo pichet. Okay, it's obvious that if he went down in value for himself, but not for his master. So before we continue about what's obvious about this, the Gemara is going to say, Hechidami, what exactly is the case? De paske l'reish one or l'reish nechire. Okay, you have an injury on the tip of your ear or on the tip of your nose where it doesn't affect your ability to work at all. So it's no loss for your master, but it is a loss for you because you're now permanently damaged. Hakol atzmo. So if you're the Eved Ivri, you're the Jewish slave, you get everything. But pichet etzel rabo, which is a debate about whether this means if it's only damage for your master or perhaps damage for both of you, okay, for your master and for you, okay, if it's for your master and for you, then it would be like the kotea yad case. If it's, right, where you cut off the hand. If it's just for the master, that basically means that by the time you get out, it won't be damaged for you because it'll heal itself. Then it's the first machloket. Right now, we've seen two machlokot, Abaye and Rava. So depending on how you understand this line, the Gemara then says, plukta d'Abaye v'Rava, it's a machlokah between Abaye and Rava. It's either relating to the first machloket they had, a case of temporary damage, and that's why it doesn't affect the Eved Ivri in the long term at all, or it means it affects both the Rabo and the Eved, and then it's the machloket that we had about cutting off the hand, where it affects both of them, and then there was this debate about whether it all goes to the, right, where it all goes into this piece of land, or it gets split, each, right, the long-term damage goes to the Eved, and the work they didn't do for those few days, or however long it might be, goes to the master. So it's referring back to one of these two machlokot, depending on how you read this line. Okay, so that was all this question Rabbi asked about temporary damage. We saw a machloket Abaye and Rava about it, and then we saw a machloket about an Eved Ivri, who's, right, there's two people to pay who gets what, and that's impermanent damage. Now we move to the next section. The Mishna had said, Boshet ha'cholafi ha'mivayesh v'hamitvayesh. So when you pay the payment of Boshet, we take into consideration the value of what people's status are, the one who caused the damage, where he is in society, and the mitbayesh, the one who is embarrassed. And we evaluate how much embarrassment, right? A very wealthy person, it's more humiliating if something happens to him because people know about him more. He's a personality, a popular person. Therefore, the humiliation will be much greater, as opposed to if it's, again, this was in a society where it's all based on status. Okay, we like to believe that that's the case, although it is somewhat the case, not always. But again, important person, whether it's poor, rich, or prominent, less prominent, it doesn't always have to be related to wealth, but someone who, that we do know that there's different people who, you know, the gradation of humiliation could be much greater for some people than others. So mani manitim, we're going to see that they're going to talk about it more in terms of wealth, okay, or at least it seems to be somewhat talking about wealth, maybe not only. Okay, the Gemara wants to know mani manitim. We're going to do in this section is bring up a machloka between the three people, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Shimon, try to figure out which one of them matches our Mishnah. And then once we already established that, then we're going to move on to a different tanaitic source and say which one of the three matches with this one. And at first glance, it's going to seem like it doesn't match with either of them. And then we're going to bring two explanations as to who it could be explained according to. So now we say mani manitin. According to is the Mishnah. Lo Rabbi Meir, velo Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, the Gemara says it's not Rabbi Meir, it's not Rabbi Yehuda, ela Rabbi Shimon. It must be Rabbi Shimon's position. So we don't know why they said this, but we're going to go through it right now. Ditnan, it says in the Mishnah. V'kulan ro'in otam ki'ilu hem ben chorim she'erdu midechsehem shehem b'nei Abraham, Yitzchak, v'Yaakov. Okay, actually it says ditnan, it should be Titania. It says in a braita. The amount of money that you pay for boshet depends on. We look at everyone as if they're a free person, meaning not a slave, but not a wealthy person necessarily, just a regular free person that now have no money. Okay, so we're going to evaluate people based on the average, it sounds like. Everyone's the same because we're all the sons of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And therefore, there is no more or less any of that. That's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Hagadol lefi godlo, Hakatan lefi kotno. Someone in there who's great goes according to them. Someone who's katan goes according to their. So basically, that actually sounds kind of like our Mishnah, that it depends on the status of the person. But our Mishnah already said it's not Rabbi Yehuda. We're going to have to see why that is. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Ashirim. Now here it becomes clear that when we talk about, gadol and katan, certainly Rabbi Shimon is talking about material wealth. So wealthy people, so we drop everybody a level. If you're wealthy, we look at you as if you're a regular free person. If you're poor, then we put you in the poorest of the poor, and we evaluate the amount they have to pay you based on that. And as we always assume, the lowest of the scale. So now we're going to see it must be Rabbi Shimon. Why? Now it's a little bit weird because Rabbi Shimon, the Mishna said it all goes according to your status in society. What we're now going to explain is your status based on, well, the lowest part of whatever group you're in. Okay, we're going to go to the lowest extreme. But it is based on wealth. You notice that Rabbi Shimon is depending on whether you're a Shiur or ani. It's just a matter of where in that range. So Rabbi Meir, if you say it's Rabbi Meir, you can't say that because Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Meir says Kulu Bahadeh. Excuse me. Rabbi Meir says they're all Bahadeh Adaninu. They're all the same. We treat them all as if they're in the same status. We don't have such a thing as status, and that affects them. So it certainly can't be Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda, manitin katanehim avayeshet asuma chayav. The problem with Rabbi Yehuda is not going to be our Mishnah. It's the continuation of the Mishnah, which is the next Mishnah, where it says, the Mishnah says, avayeshet asuma chayav. If you embarrass a blind person, you're liable. Ve'ilu Rabbi Yehuda amal suma ein lo boshet. Rabbi Yehuda says there is no boshet for a blind person, which the way we understand it right now means you don't pay damage if you embarrass a blind person. Because the assumption is the blind person doesn't see, they don't feel embarrassment the same way that other people do. Right, good question whether that's true or not. Anyway, let's put him aside for right now. We'll get back to that topic later. Elalav Rabbi Shimon. So now they're going to say it must be, if it can't by process of elimination, it can't be Rabbi Meir, it can't be Rabbi Yehuda, so it must be Rabbi Shimon, and it can't be Rabbi Yehuda because it can't be Rabbi Meir because he didn't distinguish between different people in society, different statuses. Can't be Rabbi Yehuda because he doesn't match the next line in the Mishnah, which is the summa is, you're liable for a summa if you embarrass them, and he said there is no boshet for a blind person. So it must be Rabbi Shimon. But now the Gemara goes back to Rabbi Yehuda and suggests the following. Rabbi Yehuda. Maybe you could say it's Rabbi Yehuda. And how do you explain the thing about the summa? Well, ki amar Rabbi Yehuda summa ein lo boshet. Lemishkal minei. What it means is not that a summa, notice the language. The language is a summa doesn't have boshet. That could mean a summa doesn't have to pay boshet, which is what we thought. I'm sorry. It could mean a summa doesn't get paid boshet if someone injures a summa, which is what we thought. Or it could mean, which would then go against the next Mishnah, which makes it clear. But it could be that you can't charge boshet payment to a blind person who embarrasses someone because they can't see, so maybe they don't realize that they're embarrassing someone. And then it's a whole different story about what Rabbi Yehuda is saying. And then it has nothing to do with the upcoming Mishna, and you can make it all work. And that's what it means, to make him pay to other people. But if you embarrass a blind person, of course you have to pay him. Well, it's hard to say that in the next Mishnah. Why? Because the continuation of that Mishnah is if you embarrass someone who's sleeping, you'll be liable. We're going to read this Mishnah later on today's daf. But if while you're sleeping, you embarrass. Okay, this sounds, by the way, where do you think about this? In camp, people always, or in dormitories, people always try to embarrass people while they're sleeping. So according to this, you're liable for embarrassing and humiliating someone while they're asleep, right? People always used to play tricks on people in the middle of camp. It was like the biggest thing to play pranks on people while they're sleeping. That is totally forbidden. And you'd be liable for that. But yashen should be yes. But if you were sleeping and you sleepwalked and you embarrassed someone while you were sleeping and you weren't aware of what you were doing, you'd be exempt. Now, there it distinguishes between making you pay and giving you payment. And notice there, velo katane suma should be yesh patur. It doesn't say, but a blind person who embarrasses someone will be exempt. When it did say a person who's asleep embarrasses someone, they'd be exempt. So the fact that they don't distinguish means in both directions, the summa is going to be liable. Both you have to pay the summa and the summa will have to pay. In which case, you can't say it matches Rabbi Yehuda, who clearly says there isn't boshet for a blind person. So they go back and they say, therefore, it makes the most sense that the Mishnah matches Rabbi Shimon. Now, as I said, we're going to bring a braita and try to say something to match either of the three opinions we just saw. Man tana lahad tana Rabbanan. Who's the tana of the following braita? Nitkaven levayesh takatanu b'yeshet hagadol. Noten lagadol demei boshto shel katan. If you intended to embarrass, humiliate a katan, a small person. Okay, we're going to have to define what a small person means. We have two different options. And instead, you embarrassed a gadol, not the person you intended to embarrass, but in the end, someone else got embarrassed. So you're going to pay the lower amount, the one that matches what you intended to do. You intended to humiliate a slave, and instead you humiliated a free person. You pay the free person the amount of humiliation that you would have paid for a slave, which is obviously going to be less. Money. Now, who is this according to? Lo Rabbi Meir, lo Rabbi Yehuda, lo Rabbi Shimon. Why? Well, the first thing is, what is gadol and what is katan? So when they say it doesn't match either of them, it's because kasal kadata, they thought katan b'nechasim, gadol b'nechasim. They thought katan meant you intended to humiliate a poor person, and you ended up humiliating a rich person. Now, if that's the case, you pay the rich person the amount that you intended to pay to humiliate the poor person. And this is because we've learned that boshet is all depending on your intent. If you don't have intent, you're not liable for boshet. So you can only pay the amount you had intent for. Now, here, you really intend to humiliate that person, but you did intend to humiliate somebody, so you're going to have to pay the lower amount. So now they say, Rabbi Meir, Hamar Kulu Bahade Adani. It can't be Rabbi Meir because he doesn't distinguish between wealthy and non-wealthy people. Rabbi Yehuda ha'amar ein lavadim boshet. Rabbi Yehuda holds there is no boshet for slaves. So here you say if you intended to humiliate a slave and you humiliated a free person, well, you pay the amount for a slave, but there is no amount for a slave because you don't pay boshet for a slave, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon ha'amar mitkaven levayeshet zeu b'yeshet zeh patur. Well, this is classic Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon's the one who says davar she'eino mitkaven, if you don't have intent for it on Shabbat, you're not liable. Likewise here. And if you intend to kill one person, you're not liable if you killed someone else, even though you actually intended to kill. Same thing here. If you intended to embarrass someone and you embarrass someone else, you don't pay boshet at all because you didn't have intent to humiliate this person. My time, what's his reason? Because he compares it kikal, just like he says by death. Makal, if you kill someone, adam itkavenle, you're not going to get the death penalty unless you intended to kill that person. This is Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Not everybody agrees. Because it says, and you ambushed him, you sat there and wait, and this is the pasuk which talks about murdering someone, and you got up to kill him. And they learn from there, ad shitkaven lo, because it says arav lo, you ambushed him. It's only when you intend for him. Didn't intend for him, you won't be liable. Boshet nami ad mechaven le. So boshet also will be the same. That's where we learn boshet, and we learn from there. Ad shitkaven lo, because it says it has to be she has to have intent to do it. So here you see, without intent, you're not going to be liable, and therefore Rabbi Shimon won't even make you liable at all. So this case would be exempt entirely. So it doesn't match either of the three opinions. So we're now going to explain it in two different ways. One, Lo'olam Rabbi Yehuda, v'chika amar Rabbi Yehuda, ein lavadim boshet, l'mitvala. Aval l'misham sheminam behu. Remember our case. You intended to to humiliate or to hurt a slave, and instead you hurt a free person. So what do? You pay the value you would have paid the slave. Well, it doesn't mean really the value you would have paid the slave. You wouldn't have paid the slave anything. But we could come up with, if you had been liable for a slave, even though Rabbi Yehuda thinks you're not, there is an amount of humiliation that one could pay for a slave, which will be less than what one would pay for a free person. So in this case, you ended up embarrassing a free person. So you're going to have to pay that free person, but you're going to pay based on an amount that one would have theoretically had to pay a slave, even though there really is no payment for a slave. So that's a way to explain it, Rabbi Yehuda, because it's not like you're paying the slave in this case. It's just coming up with evaluating the amount based on what one theoretically would have paid a slave. Alternatively, you could say afilu tema Rabbi Meir. Why? Because the whole thing was premised on gadol and katan meant gadol in money and katan in money, right? Poor and rich and poor. But misavar gadol b'nechasim katan b'nechasim. Why are you assuming that's the case? Look, gadol mamash, but katan mamash. It means what gadol and katan always mean, above bar mitzvah, below bar mitzvah, or something like that. To which they say, so again, you intended to injure a small person, and you injured a larger, an older person, a young person versus an old person. Now, a young person, it's less humiliation than for an older person. To which the Gemara says, and this is a question we're going to see later on also, katan bar boshet, wait a minute. There's boshet for a minor. A minor is in general someone who doesn't have knowledge and understanding. So they don't have understanding, then they're not humiliated because they don't really get it. What do you mean? Just like Rav Papa says elsewhere, we're going to say the same line. We're going to quote him another time saying this, just like he says it elsewhere. And then the third time, we're actually going to see the original place where he said this in the first place. It's a case, just like Rav Papa said somewhere else, he explained a case where there's a katan who could understand. Some minors, depending on your age and depending on your level of maturity, you would be humiliated. So there are kids, and if you're at that age where you would understand humiliation, then that's what we're talking about. But again, humiliation for a minor is going to be less in any case than for an older person. And then we can explain Rabbi Meir, because it has nothing to do with social status. Social status, he thinks, are all the same, but there is a difference between humiliation for a minor than humiliation for an older person. So just like he says it there, hachinami, likewise, you could say it by us, okay, so you humiliated him and he was humiliated by it. He was embarrassed. That's the end of our section. Now we're going to start with a new Mishna. You humiliate someone who is naked. Now the assumption here is, we're going to have to understand, what did you do? The assumption is we're talking about you took off their clothes, but they're already naked, so what are we talking about? So we'll have to see later what the intention is. You humiliate someone who's blind. This we already quoted. You humiliate someone while they're sleeping. You're liable. If they're sleeping and then they cause embarrassment, patur. Nafal min agag. If you fell from a roof, this is whole sugya we saw back in the beginning of the Masechet. Vehezik ubiyesh on daf kaf zayin. And what happened? They damaged on their way down, and biyesh, and they caused humiliation. Chayav al nezik, you're liable for damages, even though you didn't intend them, but you're patur la boshet, because ad she'em et kaven, you're not liable until you have intent for boshet. All the other, right, the nezek, you're going to be liable anyway. But boshet, you're only liable when there's intent. You fell off the roof, you fell on someone, humiliated them, but you didn't intend it, so you're not going to pay the damage. Again, for the humiliation. Now the Gemara starts off with a braita. Tanu Rabbanit. Baisho arom chayav. Ve'eno domeh baisho arom lebaisho lavush. If you embarrass someone when they're naked, again, we're going to have to figure out what exactly this is. The braita says you're liable, but it's different. It's not going to be the same as humiliating someone who wasn't naked. Baisho bebeit hamerchatz, where also people are not usually dressed in the bathhouse. Eino chayav, you're going to be liable, but again, eino domeh baisho bebeit hamerchatz lebaisho bashuk. There's a difference between taking off someone's clothes when they're in the shuk, in the middle of the marketplace, and doing it when they're in the bathhouse. So Amar, now we have to understand this. We're going to go back and quote something from the braita, which is also like the Mishna. Baisho arom chayav. Arom bar boshet too. They're already naked. What kind of humiliation are you going to do to someone who's already naked? You can't take off their clothes. They already have them off. And they also seem to have no shame. They're already walking around naked. So Amar Papa my arom. what do we mean that they were naked? It doesn't mean they stripped down naked in the middle of the street. What it means is da'ata zika karchinu lamane, a big wind came and blew their clothes up. Okay, imagine a person was wearing a robe and it comes a big wind and blows it up. Va'atahu delinu tveu baishe, and then you come along and you pick it up even more and humiliate the person. That's what we're talking about. And basho bebeit hamerchatz chayav. What about in the bathhouse? Why are you liable? Beit hamerchatz barboshet, who again, people are pretty much naked there. So Amar Papa should be show al gavan ahal. You did it by the river. Now, in the river, people are definitely more careful about how they dress. They don't strip down naked there like they do in the bathhouse, because anyone could pass by. The bathhouse, at least everyone else is naked, and you're usually with only men, or you're only with women if you're a woman. But if you're outside in the river, you're going to be more careful. Or possibly we're talking about that you went to the river, picked up your cloak a little bit to put your feet into the water, and then someone came along and picked up your cloak even more. And that's the kind of embarrassment that we're talking about here. Now we're going to have a question of Rabbi Abba bar Mamal, and we're going to have two different explanations of what his question was. And in the end, we're going to try to answer his question. We're going to bring a whole bunch of back and forths, but in the end, we're really not going to have an answer, not really according to either version, not a definitive answer anyway. By shoyashen v'meit mahu, if you humiliate someone when they're sleeping and then they die, okay, then what? And if they didn't wake up from their sleep, so you humiliated them in their sleep, but then they never woke up to kind of have experienced the humiliation. So my kamma. So the question is, what exactly is Rabbi Abba bar Mamal's question? Amar Rav Zevid. Rav Zevid says, hachi mabayle. So Rav Zevid is going to give one explanation, Rav Papa is going to give another. What the question was like this: Mishum kisufahu. Is it because of embarrassment? So this person never felt the embarrassment because they never woke up, right? In camp, when you wake up and you find out your friends totally humiliated you in the middle of the night, well, you're embarrassed when you wake up in the morning. But if you never woke up in the morning, then there's no embarrassment. You experience it, and then there would be no payment. Now, obviously, who are you paying the money to? To the heirs. O Dilma mishum zilutahu. Or do we say it's because they disgraced you? Now, you know, doing something embarrassing to someone in their sleep is a total disgrace to them. Whether they're aware of it or not, you've disgraced a person. V'ha'ozle, right? And you've done that. You've disgraced them. So which one is it? Tashma. They bring another source to try to prove it. Rabbi Meir omer, cheresh v'katan yesh lehem boshet, shoteh ein lo boshet. We're going to distinguish between the three we usually put together. Cheresh, shoteh, katan, or usually are people who don't have knowledge and understanding. So a deaf, mute, and a minor. There is boshet. If you humiliate them, you have to pay. However, a shoteh, which again is always a very hard word to explain, but someone who's a little bit crazy, okay, doesn't have a real understanding of things, well, ein lo boshet. You don't pay humiliation for this person. So again, it's hard to know how to define shoteh exactly, and it's hard to say why there's no humiliation for them, and it's part of what we're going to try to figure out here. It's possible also shoteh in different places has different meanings here. So let's try to explain. Iyamar bishlama. Now, why can we prove it from here? Well, they're going to say the following: if you say mishum ziluta, if it's because you've disgraced someone, hainu de katane katan. That's why a katan. Well, you've disgraced them. But iyamar mishum kisufa. If you're going to say you've embarrassed them, now we go back to a question we asked before. Katan bar boshetu. Now we already know the answer, but the sugya at this point doesn't know it, which is it katan? Can you humiliate? What do you mean? You can't embarrass a child. The child doesn't have any understanding. So it would be cheresh shoteh katan. Neither of them have any understanding, and you shouldn't be liable for boshet. So it proves that it's mishum ziluta. But then they say, wait a minute. It's mishum ziluta because you've disgraced someone. It doesn't matter if they have no understanding of what you've done. You've done an act that's a terrible act. You've disgraced a human being. Well, if that's the case, mishum ziluta afilu shoteh nami. Well, then you should be liable as well for a shoteh, for this person who's a little bit crazy, doesn't have any real understanding. You humiliated them also. To which they answer, Amre, and this is a phrase we saw earlier in the daf about the person who makes their father or mother go bald, shoteh en lecha boshet gdola mizo. Just their essence of being a shoteh, of this crazy person doing crazy things on the street, that's so humiliating that anything you do beyond that is not going to humiliate them anymore. This is a bit of a troubling statement, especially if we don't exactly know what exactly a shoteh means and who is in this category, right? They're not clear-minded. They're not, right? Does that mean it's a humiliation? They just walk on the streets humiliating, so you can't humiliate them further? I don't think that that's true. I have a hard time believing, right? Again, depends on your society. in our society, I'd like to believe that even if someone humiliates themselves, if you humiliate them, that's further humiliation, and you should be liable for that. In any case, the Gemara seems satisfied with this answer. So now we're going to basically prove it's ziluta and not kisufa. But then the Gemara says, so they go back and they say, okay, so mikol nakol nifshot mishen mishum ziluta, right? So let's go back to our answer, which is it's ziluta, and that's why the katan, because the katan is not bar boshet, he doesn't have any understanding. To which they write the imishum kisufa, katan bar kisufu, because if it's embarrassment, child doesn't feel embarrassment. To which Rav Papa says, right? They quote Rav Papa again. We're quoting him from somewhere else, which is going to be in the next section. The original is going to be in the next section. Rav Papa, just like Rav Papa says there. What do you mean? Katan de michlu le'umichlam, hachanami de michlu le'umichlam. In other words, there's a katan who does have an understanding. We're talking about humiliating a katan who understands exactly what it means that you're humiliating him. If it's a katan like that, then you'll be liable. If not, not. In which case, we could answer it's humiliation, or we could answer, right, it's disgrace, that you've disgraced a person, okay? So either it's the embarrassment you cause them, or it's disgrace. Either one could fit in, because it could be the katan you're talking about, as a katan who understands, and the cheresh also, the deaf mute, is also someone who totally understands that they're being humiliated. Again, we still have this problem of the shoteh, why that would be, but again, the Gemara's answers seem like they're in a different place. Rav Papa's explanation of the question is a little bit different. Hachi Kamma. This is the question. Mishum kisufa didehu v'hamile. Is it because of their own personal embarrassment? And this person was dead, so they never felt embarrassment. O dilma mishum boshet mishpacha. Or do we say, but wait, this caused humiliation to the family? Perhaps you have to compensate the family for the humiliation. We all know what it's like to have a sibling, a parent, a child, someone who might humiliate or embarrass us. Hopefully we don't all know this from personal experience, but kids love to say, oh, my parents totally embarrassed me. So is it, right? I live my life always worrying that if I do something, my kids will claim that I embarrassed them. So I'm always careful not to do things on account of that. So is it because of embarrassment to the family? And therefore, in other words, again, this is what I'm talking about is different. I'll try not to do something so as I don't embarrass my children. But the point being, if someone humiliates me, that will be embarrassing to my children. The reverse. So now, perhaps that's why. So if the person's sleeping and then they die, it was still humiliation for the family, what you did. Tashma. So now we're going to go back to that same source and do a very similar process we did before. Again, if you say it's humiliation for the family, that's why you're going to be liable if it's the minor, because it was humiliation for the family, even if the minor didn't experience the embarrassment, because they have no understanding of embarrassment. But if you're saying it's because of the embarrassment of the child himself, as again, there's embarrassment for the family and there's embarrassment for the child. Those are the two possibilities, right? And as opposed to embarrassment versus disgrace, we're doing embarrassment, but embarrassment for the child versus embarrassment for the family. So, if it's embarrassment for the child, right? The minor doesn't get embarrassed. So now they're going to say, okay, so what did you just prove? So it must be humiliation for the family. Well, if that's the case, so then a totally crazy person, same thing. If you humiliate them, fine. They don't understand it, but their family will be humiliated. To which they answer again, whether you take it or leave it, but the family is already embarrassed by them. So by you adding to it, it's not adding anymore. There is no more embarrassment that you could get more than that. Well, mikomakom. So now they go back and they say, just like we did last time, right? It can't be embarrassment because the child doesn't experience embarrassment. And here's where the original statement was made. Rav Papa answers here, because remember, this was his version of the question. He now answers and he says, it could be that the child was embarrassed, you embarrassed the child and he felt it. In other words, or she felt it. There are children who have an understanding of that. And if that's the case, then you have to pay boshet. If not, not. And then it wouldn't prove anything about this person who fell asleep and then died, right? It could be it's humiliation of the child. It could be humiliation for the family. We don't know, in which case it's not clear whether you would pay damages or not. And furthermore, Rav Papa is going to bring a proof to his answer that there are children who understand the concept of humiliation or embarrassment. V'hatanya, as it appears in a braita, Rebbe Omer Cheresh yesh lo boshet, shoteh ein lo boshet. So a cheresh, a deaf mute, does have boshet. A shoteh doesn't get boshet payment. But a katan, pa'amim yesh lo, pa'amim ein lo. Now, how can you explain that sometimes a katan would get and sometimes they wouldn't? It all depends on their level of understanding. Right? If you embarrass them and they understand it, then you're going to have to pay boshet. If you embarrass them and they don't have any understanding, then you're not going to have to pay boshet for this minor. And that really depends on the age and the level of maturity of that child. Okay, last section. Now we're going to embarrassing a blind person. So this we already learned. This Mishna is not like Rabbi Yehuda, just like we said. The previous one wasn't because of this line. Because what did Rabbi Yehuda say? Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Suma ein lo boshet. He says a Suma doesn't have boshet payment. But kachaya Rabbi Yehuda potel, he would exempt a Suma from paying boshet. This, by the way, does seem to support the reading that it's paying boshet and not getting boshet. Mechayve galuya, but obviously the Gemara views it in both directions. Also, mechayve galiot, mechayve malkiot, mechayve mito beitin. A blind person is not chayav if they kill a person accidentally to go to the refuge city. They don't get lashes and they don't get the death penalty. So now we're going to go through where he gets each of these from, and with that we'll finish our daf. My time of Rabbi Meir. So first one, why is he not liable for going to Ir Mikla? For boshet. Because it says einecha einecha, we're going to have a gzera shava. It appears in edim zomimim, and it appears by our case, of embarrassing. Mahatam sumin lo, avhacha sumin lo. So let's go to the psukim. Rashi quotes them in the Dibor Matchil de lo Rabbi Yehuda. Further down in the Rashi, it says be'edim zomimim ktiv lo tachos einecha. Do not have any mercy on false witnesses. And boshet nami k'tiva katzote et kapa, you cut off her hand, lo tachos enecha. Don't have any mercy on her. This is the woman who embarrasses the man by grabbing his genitals. Now, we don't actually cut off her hand. We say that's money, but you shouldn't have any mercy. So, lo tachos enecha. And therefore, they say enecha enecha. Now, by edim zomimim, you clearly can't be convicted if you can't see, because you have to talk about what you witnessed, what you saw. So you can't be a witness, and therefore you can't become an eid zomem. So just like you can't be an eid zomem, you're not going to pay boshet because of the enecha enecha. Mechayve galiot, titanya below raot. Okay, it says you come into the forest to chop your trees. That's describing who goes to an Ir Miklan, and you chop down, and a piece of your thing goes flying backward. But below raot, you didn't see. Now, you didn't see implies that you could see, you just didn't see that there was a person there. Prat l'suma, that comes to exclude someone who was blind and couldn't see. That's the very Rabbi Yehuda who couldn't ever see. So you're not liable to go to the Ir Mikla, whereas if someone could see, but they just didn't see this person, that's what makes them liable to go to the refuge city. Rabbi Meir Omer l'rabot et tasuma. Rabbi Meir thinks that actually includes a blind person. So now we have to see why each comes to opposite conclusions here. My tamid Rabbi Yehuda Amar Lacha. He would say, Asher yavot re'eu bayar lachtov etzim. That's the beginning. You come into the forest to chop trees. That would seem to imply anyone who could do that. Afilu suma, even a blind person could go chop trees. Kata rachmana below ra'ot lemiute. But then it says, and you couldn't see, which means again, you could see somewhere else. You couldn't see here. That addition comes to exclude something. What does it come to exclude? A blind person. Rabbi Meir says, what do you mean? Kata rachmana below ra'ot lemiute. It's true. I agree. It comes to exclude something. But also, but it also says without knowledge. Now, without knowledge and without seeing seems one and the same. That also seems limiute. And when you have miuta char miut, miuta char miut, ela, this is like a double negative. When you have one coming to exclude and another coming to exclude something else, we say basically they knock each other out and you end up coming to include something more. Therefore, he says it must come to include someone who actually could never see or never know because they were blind. They're actually also going to have to go to a refuge city, and that's Rabbi Meir, who disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda. But Rabbi Yehuda, what does he do with bivli dat then, if he doesn't think it's a miut and another miut? Well, bivli dat, prat lemitkaben hu dat. Bivli dat comes to say, not if you intended. If you intended to kill someone, then you're not going to go to a refuge city, because you're actually worse, right? A blind person he thinks didn't really even know. They're not going to go because they're not even obligated. The one who had intention is much closer to intentional murder, right? Let's say they intended one person, but they killed somebody else. or they intended that person, they're certainly not going to go to your miklat, they're going to get murdered. Where does he get that from? Well, once you have the summa isn't part of going to the ir miklat, then we can learn from the word rotzach, which appears. Okay, Rashi again quotes the psukim in Bamidbar Lamed Hey, lo tikul kofer lenefesh rotzach. Don't take a ransom payment for the soul of a murderer. And by malkot it said no by the refuge city, it says lanu shama rotzach, that the murderer can go there, can run away there. Rotzach. From there we learn from the refuge city to a regular murder case. Once you have that, well, if for a murderer who gets punished by the court, death by the court, you're called a rasha, shehu rasha lamut. And by yan bin hakota rasha, which is by malkot, there rasha appears. We're going to learn from one to the other. Okay, so what did we see today? We started with this question of Raba. Then we had a machloket Abaye and Rava about his question: is there shevet for temporary damage? Then we talked about permanent damage to an Eved Ivri. We had another machloket Abaye and Rava. Then we talked about Boshet and which opinion this correlates with. The Boshet all goes by the Mivayesh, and the Mitvayesh, it depends who did the damage and who received who was humiliated and where they are in society. That seemed to match Rabbi Shimon. And then we brought another braita where we tried to connect that to one of the three opinions that we saw. We in the end said either Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Yehuda. Then we brought this Mishna about embarrassing someone who's already somewhat naked, someone who's sleeping, someone who's blind. You're going to be liable in all those cases. And then we went off on trying to understand what was the humiliation you did for the naked person. Also, we add this Beit Merchatz, which came up in the braita. And then we had this big question of Rabbi Abba Mamal. If you embarrass someone when they're sleeping and then they die, what's the case? And then we had two ways of understanding the question. Either which way, we didn't really come up with an answer. We tried to, but we weren't successful based on this other source about a katana and a cheresh versus a shoteh. And in the end, we couldn't really conclude. And then we talked about how the part that says mevayesh tasuma proves that our Mishnah can't be Rabbi Yehuda. And then we brought the approach of Rabbi Yehuda, the way he dealt with blind people and exempted them from all sorts of situations, whether it be going to a refuge city, being convicted of murder, getting lashes for some sin they did. He had a particular approach that seems to go against the mainstream approach in our Mishnah. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and a Shavua Tov.